Our question continues to be the same one that we're pursuing relentlessly through these webinars and workbooks and coaching session is how might we track and report our impact in reducing local poverty to our stakeholders. And again, the rationale for doing that, why would we even get out of bed to do that, is we have a very clear intent. We want to, at a minimum, communicate something coherent to ourselves and to others about what it is we're doing in a roughly right fashion. Most people, when you're dealing with something complex, crave coherency. And if we can get that coherency, we also lay the basis for doing more sophisticated kind of things, such as constantly adapting strategy based on our understanding of our progress, number one. And number two, making bigger strategic choices about whether we should wind something down or scale it up or try and prove our impact to others for continued funding. But we don't get those out of scope items there until we do what we are trying to do in this project, which is in scope, which is better coherently track and communicate outcomes. We have this multi-level framework that we've adapted for the uses of poverty reduction that's got these different dimensions, which says if we want to have impact on poverty, we have to make change in these other areas. And we spent our last webinars talking about shifting awareness, nudging systems, and supporting niche innovations. And this session, we're going to talk about impact on poverty. And we've got some framing here, citywide or population level changes in poverty, targeted groups or areas, and intervention beneficiaries or programmatic intervention. That's what we're going to focus on today. So let's turn our attention to some definitions of the wording we used in the diagram. So programmatic, targeted, and population or citywide impacts. So programmatic interventions, all three of these things are important, but they are different scales of impact. Programmatic impact is the effect of an intervention on like a program or a service or even a policy that directly on people affected by it. It's a programmatic impact. I went to this job sharing program and I got a job, and that my impact on poverty is the following. So intervention equals effect on me equals impact. Targeted intervention is actually where we've got a bunch of interventions going on in an area and they start consolidating or showing up for different groups of people. Oh, gee whiz, new Canadians are getting jobs faster than they ever would, or specific neighborhoods or geographic areas. The city of Kawartha, the neighborhood X in St. John, etc. So it's the cumulative impact for targeted groups or targeted geographic areas. That's different than programmatic impacts because targeted and geographic impacts tend to be the accumulation of multiple interventions. Citywide or population level impact refers to our ability to move the needle overall in our community. So if we're working in St. John, it's not just impact because of a program or impact in a neighborhood, it's impact overall, population. And all three of these are important. And of course, we're most interested in moving the needle at the citywide population level, but we don't get that until we get some programmatic and targeted level impact. And targeted and programmatic impacts are the ones that represent the kinds of things that we're most likely able to make progress on in the early days of our effort, and therefore really important to track and communicate to our stakeholders. So in order to illustrate this, why don't we take a look at some of the poverty reduction work that other communities are doing and see if we can interpret some of their reported impacts within these lenses. Now, Dufferin County actually has taken this lens explicitly in their project report, their poverty reduction report, and this is a diagram taken from that. They've got three priorities: housing and homelessness, employment, and health and equity. And they have a strong equity lens, and so they've got lots of activities going on in those areas, but what they're alerting us to is that they anticipate and plan for and intend to track and communicate three types of impact: programmatic impact, targeted impact, and population level impact. And they've got these goals on the left-hand side of that diagram, and they acknowledge, which is really helpful, that programmatic impact is probably the easiest to track, to achieve, never mind track and communicate, and population level impact is the most difficult to achieve and to track and communicate. But they acknowledge this, and when you read the report, you can get a flavor of how they're communicating that in a productive way using this framework. Kawartha Lakes has not participated in this initiative, but they've got some interesting things going on there, including a 5-pillar poverty reduction strategy around children and youth, employment and education, transportation, food security, and housing and homelessness. Now, when I took a quick look at their one of their reports, their documents, or stories, they started talking about impacts, and it was awfully easy to describe the different kinds of impacts. So programmatic impact, they have got a new wraparound service and joint referral model where people who are experiencing chronic homelessness can get different kinds of support. And so if they wanted to communicate that, they could say, hey, here's X number of people using this wraparound support model. And when we track, here's some immediate benefits that they might be experiencing, including, for example, improvements in mental health. That was referred to. Well, they also have targeted impact, and they don't really focus on different demographic groups like other plans might, but they do focus, they acknowledge they're in a region with different micro areas, including the city of Haliburton and the city of Kawartha Lakes. And so they could, and they didn't, but they could say, here's how we're doing cumulatively with chronic homelessness in each of the cities. It's not the entire region, but it's in a targeted area or for a targeted group. They actually do have information on population or citywide level impact, and they've tracked that out of 90 chronic families that, families that are experiencing chronic homelessness, they've got slightly over 50% improvement in those families now having helpful housing. So this makes a lot of sense, these two issues. We really want to talk about programmatic impact, and we want the people know that if we can get programmatic and targeted impact, we can see a line of sight to population level impact. Now, with that definition under our belt, we will move on to the next slide. We're going to talk about 4 challenges that need to be managed, much like we talked about in the last module, different challenges that in order to be able to track and communicate progress at those 3 levels, we're going to have to navigate. And again, how each of you navigate this is going to be unique, but we think all of you will at least have these 4 challenges and hopefully can benefit from some of the thinking in this webinar. And as we do that, we've got these 12 principles that we want you to keep in mind as we proceed. You'll see them in your workbook. These are meant to be like checklists to say, as I'm navigating these challenges, let's keep these principles in mind. Now let's deal with the first challenge, this framing challenge. Now, this is actually a blast from the past. We're going to go back to our very first module and remind ourselves of a very simple fact, that there is no agreed upon definition of poverty, nor agreed upon impact framework for poverty reduction in Canada at the local level. Some of you know that there's work being done with the federal government and the dashboard, and that is a promising thing, which we'll talk about right away. But for your purposes of managing citywide efforts to reduce poverty, there is no agreed upon definition. So that means you have to frame the definition of poverty and come up with your own domains and indicators and thresholds for poverty reduction. Feel comfortable with the rationale for these choices and communicate this framing to your stakeholders. You can say this is our working definition and impact framework and not the only one, but it's the one we're using as a clumsy proxy for a complex issue of poverty reduction. Now, when we talk about impact framework, again, here are the dimensions of it. A working definition of poverty and poverty reduction. What is poverty and what does it look like when it's reduced? The domains that you find important, employment, income, housing, everyone's got domains in their plans or pillars using different language, but what areas are you concerned about? What are the indicators that suggest progress? Number 3, and finally, when are you in and out of poverty or in and out of stages of poverty? These are all questions that are typically asked when you're trying to track and communicate progress. So let's refer back to the principle that number 2, that we have to accept the imperfection of poverty impact measures. And again, we won't go into this in depth, but you pick up a newspaper, you sit in on a phone call talking about metrics in poverty, you're gonna hear a dump load of debates, different conceptions of poverty, each with their different implications for measurement. So this story is the one we saw in the very first webinar, Foundations for Measurement. I'm going to read it again because it's so powerful. This is a vignette of a woman, a single mom experiencing poverty. Every problem magnifies the impact of others, and all are so tightly interlocked that one reversal could produce a chain reaction with results far distant from the original causes. A rundown apartment can exacerbate a child's asthma, which leads to a call for an ambulance, which generates a medical bill that cannot be paid, which ruins a credit record, which hikes the interest rate on an auto loan, which forces the purchase of an unreliable used car, which jeopardizes the mother's punctuality at work, which limits her promotion and earning capacity, which confines her yet again to poor housing. So imagine this. This is a real dynamic, interrelated story of cause and effects. And we probably could spend a lot of time measuring her journey in and out of poverty, both her downward spiral and hopefully whatever we could contribute in terms of an upward spiral, support her in that process. But this by itself would be a measurement challenge. Now try and do this on scale. And this is the challenge. When people try and do that on scale, here's what they're caught up with. All the different dimensions of poverty. What should be included? She's got 5 or 6 dimensions of poverty in her story. Others may have 2, others yet may have 12. Is there a difference between working poor poverty or homeless poverty or temporarily unemployed poverty? Is there a difference for different groups? A homeless youth in Victoria versus a senior in northern Newfoundland? Different geographies, different worldviews, political opinions, even the Fraser Institute and the Canadian Council on Social Development don't agree on the thresholds of income poverty. So there's all of these debates. And you'll see those dates show up in different measurement frameworks. So the self-sufficiency scale here, this is an interesting one taken from the States. You can see on the left-hand side, they've got 5 or 5 different levels of poverty or self-sufficiency in 8 or 9 different domains of self-sufficiency: housing, income, employment, etc. All of these represent different worldviews, and they all have their own metric implications. There's even some population level metrics that we're exploring, and those of you involved in vibrant communities know that we're starting to do some work with the federal government's emerging poverty dashboard. So there's lots out there, but again, feel happy that there's a lot out there, but you still have to make a choice to coming up with your own definition and approach to poverty. And I'll refer to Hamilton once again. They have a comprehensive approach to reducing poverty, but they chose, at least in their early years, to focus on income as the primary metric for tracking and communicating impact. Why? Because poverty is much more than a lack of income, but it always includes a lack of income. So they thought that was a blunt proxy. Now, this is what you will have to deal with. What's your working definition of poverty and poverty reduction, and what frameworks are you going to use to describe your work in your community? Number 2, the alignment challenge. As you're looking for your framework to describe poverty reduction, the other challenge that people like the federal government don't have to worry about, because they're working with the country citywide, is how are you going to align the way you talk about and track and communicate progress from programmatic level to targeted level to citywide level? And I'm going to simplify that for the next session. How do you know your bird's eye view of poverty reduction tracking at a population level aligns with your zooming in worm's eye view of tracking poverty for specific interventions? Well, this is a real big challenge, because people are going to want, maybe not consistency, but they're going to want a coherency around how we navigate that. So we're going to have to, we're going to show you now 4 different ways of trying to deal with alignment or lack of alignment between citywide, population level wide measures and programmatic intervention measures. And so here are the ways we're framing this for a moment. We're saying 2 choices, 2 different dimensions create 4 different choices. Are you going to use a multi-dimensional framework for poverty reduction, or focus on a traditional income-based framework where most of the measurement stuff is done and is most easy? There's a choice. Are you going to look at just accept a weak alignment between programmatic target and population level impact, meaning they're like 3 tectonic plates that don't really align with each other? They kind of move against each other, but they're not aligned. Or are you going to look for a strong alignment between how you frame and measure poverty at the citywide level, population level, aligns perfectly with the way you do programmatic impact? So these give you at least 4 different choices, and we're going to walk through each of those now. Number 1, your option 1 is to come up with a top-down, multi-dimensional impact framework. We are going to use the Canadian Index of Well-Being or the federal government's emerging poverty dashboard, or social determinants of health. And what we're going to do is say that is our framework, and at the targeted level, and when we come up with program intervention frameworks, we're going to align conceptually with that and use the same kind of indicators, right? So we can see in a real clear line of sight. Well, why is that great? Well, it's great because it's multidimensional, and most people accept that poverty is multidimensional. Certainly the anecdote of the single woman in that downward spiral that kicked us off, she's got a multidimensional challenge to deal with, and we have a multidimensional challenge to support her. It probably improves probabilities of alignment across different areas of impact. We might even have more powerful strategies if we align our work that way. But here's the difficulty. It requires a real effort to land on common domains and indicators. What will be your multidimensional framework? You have to use a patchwork of data and sources with different reporting periods. So can you weave all this stuff together that's multidimensional? And population level benchmarking is really difficult because if you want to compare your city against others, it's really uneven across the country whether other cities are using multidimensional impact frameworks. So that's the upside and that's the downside. Option one, let's pretend Dufferin was doing it. If Dufferin said we want to use a multidimensional framework, and they really are in fact shaped by the social determinants of health, they would pull together whatever data they could find on how well their Dufferin County was doing in the areas of employment, health equity, housing, and homelessness. And they'd have to cobble it together because no one gives you that in a very clean index. The social determinants of health are a common framework, but there's no common measurement package for that. So we are cobbling this from StatsCan, from county statistics, etc., and trying to come up with a coherent picture of how this works over time. We would then encourage others to use that framework, whoever was involved in their poverty reduction effort, and then we would do our best to cobble together whatever data they gave us on their programmatic interventions to be multidimensional. So we have a multidimensional lens, but we have a real hodgepodge of metrics, right? That's the trade-off. Let's go for option two. What if we just said, look, let's have one aligned framework, but let's just do income, because income is relatively easily gathered. It's really focused and convergent, and the people tend to understand income. So we would go LICO, LIM, or market basket measures. We would, at the targeted level, we would track income changes and thresholds for different groups. How well is our neighborhood doing? How well is that demographic group doing? And of course, StatsCan and the tax filer data break things up by communities and groups, not everywhere, but they do. So that's pretty easy. So LICO, LIM, MBM comes out regularly. So does, you can break it down by demographic group and community. And you would say at the programmatic level, saying whatever your project is, for sure track income. So that's simple, isn't it? And it's easier to collect the three scales. Here's the problem. It's too unidimensional for most people. Most people bristle when you say it's just income. And then it actually requires that all interventions show a line of sight between what they're doing and an income-based definition. So if you're the chronic homeless person getting wraparound support in Kawartha on a whole bunch of different issues around housing and mental health, there's really no apparent income increase at that level. And so what is really good work and important work to end homelessness actually doesn't show up on the radar because there's not an immediate income dimension. So it means we miss a lot of good progress by being so unidimensional, but that's an option. So that's what Dufferin County would do. They would focus, if they did that, they'd say, sure, we've got these homelessness, employment, and health equity outcomes. We would track population level changes and pretty easily track levels of changes for demographic groups and housing. The challenge is you could track that changes, but their ability to show impact on those would only be readily apparent probably in the employment dimension, which is the only one that lends itself somewhat to income-based tracking. We would probably miss the entire story on housing, homelessness, and health equity. Option three, this is more of a hodgepodge. Number one, this is more like the Hamilton story, I think. What we say is, look, for the purposes of tracking overall change, the population level, we're going to stick to income-based measures because that's already tracked. And we can get regular data on that, and it's not the only definition or measurement of poverty, but it's a good proxy. However, when it gets down to the programmatic level, specific interventions, be they niche innovations or policies, we're going to use multidimensional frameworks that seem suitable to that intervention. So it's very case by case. So that is kind of the best of both worlds and the worst of both worlds. The best of both worlds because we can keep busy tracking bluntly overall changes, and at the programmatic level, we can actually be more flexible and adapt measurement frameworks to specific interventions. The problem of that is people may actually think, well, whatever you're doing at the programmatic level, poverty really is just a lack of income, and if that's the only thing we're tracking, that may diminish my understanding of what poverty is, or it might give us an artificially low or high sense of progress. And it's probably very disappointing for people who want to see an overall bottom line assessment about have we reduced poverty in a multidimensional way. But that is an option. So again, implications for Dufferin, we would track population level income changes across the board. However, in the case for population and targeted, but for Dufferin, we would let Dufferin, Dufferin would have customized programmatic indicators for housing, homelessness, employment, and health equity that were more relevant and immediate. Let's look at the last option, a patch of multidimensional frameworks at each levels. This is actually a pretty tough option. I haven't seen anyone do it, but it's a legitimate one. And that's where you could use social determinants of health, the deprivation index, et cetera, at the population level. You could use multidimensional changes at the programmatic level using whatever tools you wanted. And what you're doing again is saying, look, we're simply trying to give you an impression of progress, but you can't reduce it to a bottom line scorecard at any level. We're giving you very clumsily directionally correct indicators of are we moving in a direction at all those levels, but there's really no bottom line story to it. So why is that good? Well, it reinforces that poverty is multidimensional, and it gives you different feedback loops on are we making progress using different metrics, but it's tougher to tell a coherent story. It's really difficult to get reliable and valid data across all those different measurement circuses, and it's almost impossible to benchmark meaningfully against other communities if you wanted to do that. So folks, well, I won't go into the implications for Dufferin. You can read that in the PowerPoint, but that's a legitimate option for them. So when you're thinking about, let's say you've accepted the fact that you want to frame poverty in a certain way, and you are fine with saying we have to come up with our own working version of this, one of the challenges you're going to have to deal with is this one here. You want to use multidimensional or unidimensional income-based, and you want a loose alignment or a tight alignment across scales. You've got these four options in front of you. None of them are perfect. All of them should be understood for their strengths and weaknesses, and simply feel confident in whatever choice you make about what option works best for you. Okay, these are key questions for your leadership group. Let's go on to the last two challenges, which are relatively quick. The contribution challenge, we're revisiting this because we've touched on it a couple of times. And the challenge is whenever you see outcomes changes, however you may measure them, whatever impact framework you choose, we're not always clear the extent to which we contributed to those outcomes. And people are going to see that stuff and say, how do I know that you contributed to those programmatic changes? It looked like the Chamber of Commerce and the Department of Employment ran that program, or that homelessness in that neighborhood may be because housing prices went down. How do we know that we've reduced chronic homelessness in Kawartha? Well, this is where we have to return back to the principle of contribution analysis, where even at a minimum, we will use the language in our reports of here is an impact and here is how the Poverty Reduction Initiative and our partners contributed to those impacts and outcomes. So simply the language itself will already diffuse that issue a little bit. And if people want to go beyond the language, you will have in your workbook a description of the different kinds of contribution options you might employ. Now, I'm going to say this based on a little bit of experience. I think everyone should get serious about contribution language, and that should be in the DNA of all our communication and tracking. But you should cautiously proceed with going into absolute systematically employing contribution methods because they take a bit of work. Groups that have level 3 capacity, more time, more effort, more sophistication and resources, you should probably start experimenting with contribution analysis. Those of you that have very modest capacity, just maybe poke around and look at some of these resources, but for the most part, feel comfortable with only using contribution language. At least that acknowledges you know that you're only one piece of the impact puzzle, not the entire puzzle. I'm not going to go through these examples again. We did it in the Foundations for Measurement workshop, but you remember that two of the easiest techniques we use for those who are somewhat on the cusp of things and saying, well, I don't got a lot of capacity, but I'd like to try, is this idea of using stakeholder estimates, where you tell an outcome story and then you ask all the stakeholders to rate the contribution of different partners, including the roundtable contribution in making things happen. So I've given you these case studies in the first Foundations for Measurement. I won't give them to you again, but it is this stakeholder assessment process that we described earlier. So that's your challenge, to deal with the contribution one. The last challenge is a bit kind of metaphysical in a way. Like, this one is not easy, but in fact, quite frankly, it doesn't often show up. But if it does show up, I think we should be confident in our response, or at least be clear in our response. And that is the threshold for getting in and out of poverty. People will say, well, that's really good progress, but is someone out of poverty? Big statement. They may have more income, they may have kids going to school, they may have better housing, but are they out of poverty? Well, the problem is there is no, that discussion is highly subjective. Even when people come up with thresholds that researchers agree with, I've been in focus groups where someone said, and stood up and said, I'm under that low income cutoff rate and I'm not poor. That is a very subjective thing. So what we have to do is be very careful on how we communicate this work. We might say reducing poverty, but we don't shouldn't feel a lot of confidence about saying that we've ended poverty. Unlike ending homelessness, which is a bit easier to describe, not much, but somewhat, ending poverty is much harder to describe. Here's a quote that really illustrates this. And again, it's from the best book I've ever read on this topic, The Working Poor Invisible in America. The quote from David Shipler is, an exit from poverty is not like showing your passport and crossing your frontier. There's a broad strip of contested territory between destitution and comfort, and the passage is not the same distance for everyone. So this says it's highly subjective. So here are some tips when we deal with this. Someone says, if you're using the language of exiting poverty, confirm that defining if someone is in and out of poverty is very subjective, varies from person to person, and is not a binary distinction between in and out. Just saying it's not. You use that quote, you use examples to illustrate that. Let people know that it's a good question, but there's not an obvious answer. If you're using existing thresholds around in and out of poverty, so let's say, for example, you used LICO, where LICO has above and below, you're above LICO or you're above LICO, you should just talk about them as very rough thresholds, not completely accurate, but they're kind of working thresholds, just like we have working definitions of poverty. And if you're really needing more than that, consider getting first-person testimonials to allow people to reflect on their level of impact and the changes and why they're significant to them. So you don't impose a solution, you'd say, here's the programmatic initiative and here are the outcomes, or here's dealing with people who are experiencing chronic homelessness, and let them describe their journey in and out of homelessness or poverty, and use their language to express whether they think they're in poverty or not, or on some significant journey out of poverty. So be careful around the language, talk about any existing thresholds as working thresholds and just roughly write, and let first person testimonials illustrate that for you. Don't try and prove that on your own. So you've got questions for yourself. What questions emerge for you about your thresholds for poverty reduction in your work, and what are the implications for your work moving forward? Those are 4 different challenges, folks: the framing challenge, the alignment challenge, the contribution challenge, and the threshold challenge. You're all going to experience them in your work, but how you do that is up to you. Hopefully this gave you a little bit of insight about how to navigate those. Natasha, over to you.